The Chinese government was probably a little bit comforted by the fact that Dr. Li has died, and therefore it can then appropriate Dr. Li's death for its own propaganda purposes. Because, if Dr. Li was still alive, then it can continue to make criticism of the government. Then the government will not be able to actually use Dr. Li in the way that it has.
What are they even saying? My chance to go watch Made in China. We play ping pong.
Hello and welcome to China Talk, now posted on Lawfare. I'm your host, Jordan Schneider, here today with the Neican crew to talk coronavirus domestic CCP messaging and Australia-China relations. Also, if anyone has an ad budget, please reach out. We're slashing our rates here at China Talk. Ni and Yun Jiang are both ex-Aussie government officials who've recently started their own think tank. Adam and Yun, welcome to China Talk.
Thanks for having us, Jordan.
So let's take it back to December 2019. Would you two like to walk me through the official timeline of the coronavirus?
We heard about the coronavirus probably around December. Retrospectively, they detect the coronavirus around early December, late November, I think. And the first thing most people heard about this is actually when people were detained for spreading rumors. So at that time, the virus has not been officially confirmed, but people got detained for spreading rumors. So something was going on. And the only got officially confirmation of the virus outbreak was in mid-January when there was a central directive from Xi Jinping. So that's when everything happened. That's when, we start to shut down cities, we start to seeing building of hospitals, and the government, government start to push all their effort towards containing the virus. For a while there was quite a lot of report from independent journalists, from citizen journalists. But 2 weeks after that, there was a crackdown of reporting as well. So every information then becomes centralized again.
I think the most important points for me are that it was. I think there was an imperative by the local authorities to not report the bad news and to actively suppress the reporting and investigation by Chinese journalists, citizen journalists, and doctors and others. So I think these efforts do reflect the features of the Chinese system, but as well as the local political calendar at the time, which came into play with the local Lianghui.
Sure. So let's focus in on that sort of late December, early January period before Xi said that this is actually a big deal and the country's going to need to really change its modus operandi to get a handle on the disease. So, one of the most incredible documents to come out of this is this Renwu article in which Ai Fen, one of the original whistleblowers, a doctor in one of the Wuhan hospitals, which was hardest hit, her sort of telling her story. So the salient quote to me was when she sent out a medical report of someone who had this very curious SARS-like disease, ended up getting called in by her hospital's control department head and got the strongest reprimand of her career. The quote she had of this like Laoban telling her was that, quote, "We can't hold our heads up when we go out for a meeting. The doctor criticized us, saying that she's a professional and she has no principles and no sense of team discipline to go out and stir rumors and stir up trouble." Mm-hmm. So what are the factors, or what is it about the system that ripples down to a local hospital administrator reprimanding one of their longtime practitioners for talking about a potentially new infectious disease?
We'll be talking about the case of Dr. Li Wen now a bit later, but I think the parallel in this case, or in these two cases, is that politics seems to have played a really important part. So, on any other circumstances, you might have the managers, administrators, and the politicians listening to the doctors. But in this case, we see numerous examples of where really politics and bureaucracy and bureaucratic factors rather play an important part. So in this case, it's about not stirring trouble to prevent the flow of bad news upward. I really do think that the early misstep is not just local authorities suppressing whistleblowers or individual doctors, but it's a result of some systemic issues of the Chinese system.
We also need to think that about this more broadly, because really no one likes to be the bearer of bad news. And we have seen cases not just in China but elsewhere that the messenger of the bad news gets all the downside risks but no rewards, so no upside rewards. And speaking truth to power has always been a very dangerous action for individuals. Of course, the prevailing incentive in China and elsewhere is to reduce major problems to minor ones and minor ones to nothing. So the mentality of 大事化小，小事化了. And the thing is that most of the time the problems do go away by themselves, but occasionally they turn into bigger problems, such as this case. And whistleblowers such as Dr. Li or Dr. I, well, they generally pay a severe and negative consequence for their actions. It is even more so the problem in China because there is no freedom press. And going against the government directly can, one, get you blacklist for future employment, and two, you may even get jailed. So those kind of pressure is not present in some other countries where there is democracy. But even in democratic countries, whistleblowing and speaking truth power is difficult as well.
Totally. I mean, just being on Twitter these past few days, seeing American nurses being fired because they complained that they're not, that their hospital administrators are upset with them wearing their own masks is sort of the same dynamic, except that video is allowed to go viral, and that's then exactly the sort of the time it gets that these issues get processed is much faster because there is a more open media environment. It's so depressing.
Yes. Well, when we first, looking at things in China, we thought, the authoritarian government is not handling this very well. It's quite depressing, the consequences coming out of it. And now we're seeing a lot of same mistakes being repeated in the United States, in Australia. It is very, very depressing.
So let's talk about the second whistleblower, Liang, who unfortunately passed away and has now become a real tug of war in the internal domestic propaganda space. So what happened there, and how is the government trying to neutralize the example he set?
Well, I think the Chinese government was probably a little bit comforted by the fact that Dr. Li has died. And therefore, it can then appropriate Dr. Li's death for its own propaganda purposes. Because, if Dr. Li was still alive, then it can continue to make criticism of the government. Then the government will not be able to actually use Dr. Li in the way that it has.
Yeah.
But because Dr. Li has died, it can no longer voice its oppositions anymore. Then I guess from government's perspective, that is a time when you can really use Dr. Li to show Dr. Li as a national hero, a martyr, which is the things, the framing we're seeing right now.
I think there's two sides to this. On one side, the death of Dr. Li led to an outpouring of grief and frustration among the Chinese netizens. And, I was awake that night on following Chinese social media, and certainly it's been a long time since I last saw that kind of outpouring of anger towards the authorities. So I think Dr. Li has become a really important figure in the current narratives about the virus. And on the other side, as Yun has said, the party is trying to appropriate the legacy of Dr. Li, reclaiming him as a good party member, as working selflessly against the virus, instead of as somebody who's blowing whistle, or rather against the system. So they certainly put a lot of effort into interpreting Dr. Li's actions and his legacy, and also making it very clear that there's only one interpretation of Dr. Li's actions and legacies, and that is the one set down by the party.
We saw when he died that there was a call for freedom of speech, in China on the internet. But the Chinese government obviously will not allow this to become a catalyst for change. So what it does is it redirects the attention, redirects the energy of the people or the grief towards co-opting the narrative, towards casting him in the role of a national hero as opposed to a whistleblower.
I think Dr. Lee has really been cast as almost a selfless martyr in the people's war against the relentless virus that China's been fighting, right? So he's been cast in a new light, as opposed to the very common understanding of Dr. Lee at the time, which was a doctor walking on the front lines and somebody who had the conscience to warn his friends that something's a mysterious virus is happening, and was censured for it and was gagged by the authorities for doing that.
We also see recently that there was an official exoneration apology to Dr. Lee. So I think that shows, on the one side, putting the blame onto local authority for what happened to Dr. Lee, and two, basically co-opting Dr. Lee. That's another way of co-opting Dr. Lee by issuing an official apology.
Well, one second, Ying. So it's not really an apology because it, like, in no way did it kind of.
No, sorry, it wasn't an apology. It was.
I don't think there was actually an apology. There was indeed a verdict by China's National Supervisory Commission investigating into this saga.
A verdict, yeah.
Yeah, and what it really said was that it was irregular law enforcement procedure at the very local level. So it specifically referred to a few rather public security officials that were
in the
responsible
local
for
police
this.
Station.
That's right, very local police station. In fact, not even a proper policeman. They were something like auxiliary or like very, very much very junior. Very junior officers.
And so now we have found someone to blame, and now public
the 23-year-olds.
Exactly.
It's a very common thing to do whenever something goes wrong. You blame the intern, right?
There you go. Yeah. I mean, I think this is an attempt to distance the party from what happened, to kind of differentiate the party from the local level, the local authorities, or rather in this case this very specific personnel that was responsible for this. And really the subtext here is to say it wasn't a systemic failure, rather it was
individuals
that made the mistake.
So aside from the specific sort of Wuhan local government dynamics, what other narratives is the government trying to push domestically? And just for the record, we're recording this on April 2nd.
Yeah. Well, one big things that so at first, we saw it was trying to suppress information. Now it's turned to unify people by talking about doctors as heroes. And now we're seeing the next stage, which is compare China's response to response of countries, especially the United States, because from China's perspective, the United States is a peer competitor to China, and Chinese government wants to demonstrate that it can handle things better than the United States. So two things that it's got going in terms of propaganda. One is that the Chinese government may have done things that's not perfect, but at least it has done better than the West or the United States. And secondly, we don't know whether the origin of the virus is from China. Therefore, you shouldn't blame China. And instead we're helping countries around the world to handle this crisis. Now, of course, almost all the evidence point to the China origin of the virus. But what the Chinese government is doing is to really saying, we're not here to blame, but we're here to help.
Yeah. So if I might just add to that. So I think there's a difference between the Well, there's the domestic and international aspects of the propaganda effort. So domestically, it's about deflecting the blame. It's about
Mm.
suppressing voices that highlights the failings of China's political system and the party, especially the early missteps by the local authorities. Yeah, and systemic issues with the system about the pressures on local cadres to not report bad news and to suppress these voices that are in their view causing trouble. The second big element of this propaganda is the feel good aspect. The we're unified. We're carrying out a people's war. We're helping each other under the leadership of the party state. So a nationalistic, very much nationalistic rendering of the narrative. So yeah, certainly leveraging nationalism to deflect blame as well as to unify the Chinese populace.
Yeah, but I think that a lot of propaganda seemingly targeted at the international audience, has a very big domestic focus as well. And we see that
Yeah.
a lot of
Mm.
things, a lot of there's a section of the Chinese population that's quite willingly to believe that elsewhere as well, that US is behind everything, the United States is behind everything. And that section of the audience is probably very prone to conspiracy theories, and we're seeing that it may be quite successful at targeting that section of the audience, even when it is also targeting foreign audience for its propaganda purposes.
Do you guys care to engage in some wild speculation on to what extent all of this messaging will end up working, and whether anyone on the mainland is going to fundamentally change their view of the current system?
I think propaganda such as this, it is quite successful in one way, but it plays to existing prejudices. So people who already believe that United States is evil and is the mastermind behind all the things that's bad, they will already willingly believe in conspiracy theory that United States has a manufactured bioweapon. And it's the same in the United States as well. People who willingly believe, who already think that China is evil and is a mastermind behind everything bad that has happened, will also believe that China has made biological weapons. So I think it just amplifies the existing prejudices. I'm not sure if it really would change people's mind, like if someone who used to believe US is evil and behind everything now suddenly will believe China is evil and behind everything.
China's effort of introducing doubt as to where the virus comes from, I don't think it's very convincing for anybody that's following the virus, that has been reading the news. But it does create doubt, especially when amplified by misinformation and conspiracy theorists in other countries, right? It introduces that element of doubt that's amplified through modern technology and social media and what have you.
Conspiracy theories are often called by the state, by the government to promote certain views. I think with regards to the origin of the virus, it probably would work more successfully domestically than internationally, because if you are in China, you probably don't want the virus to be originated in China either. So they probably already have an inclination to want to believe that the origin of the virus is elsewhere.
So do you think this experience of the virus changes at all Xi's mindset or the way the government goes about its work?
Yeah, I think there's two aspects to it. The first aspect is about control, and that is about the government's ability to ensure that it can watch what the population is doing. So in this case, I think the lesson that one of the lessons that Beijing got was we really have to understand what is happening on the local level in terms of public health, and that kind of argues for more data, for more surveillance, for more reporting, for more technology that helps the central government keeps track of individuals as well as its local cadres. So I think that argues for a more pervasive surveillance system. The other one, of course, is more internationally focused, and that is, I think, COVID-19 is impressing on Chinese leaders the idea that the world is not going to always be as interconnected and globalized as it is 6 months ago, as it is today. There could be radical changes in a very short period of time that breaks these connections.
So are you saying it may lead to more intentional decoupling?
Intentionally, yes, perhaps, but more so in terms of resilience, I think, or self-reliance. I think, yeah, China very much believes, or Chinese leaders rather, very much believes in the idea of self-reliance, and I think the economic and supply chain, and also travel challenges that's created by COVID-19 is going to emphasize that.
The 2 points you've raised are very good. And we're also seeing this trend elsewhere, not just in China, but I suspect more so in China. One is about control. Now we let the control genie out of the bottle, that it's very hard to put it back. Surveillance efforts, controlling of the population, of where they're going, of enforcing them to stay at home. I think those are the things that the Chinese government probably will take notes about. And we're also seeing elsewhere, including Australia, that we're seeing a lot of increased police powers as well. Law enforcement agencies getting more power. So this state versus individual liberty issue is probably going to be quite prominent. Second one you talked about was about trade and self-reliance, and we're seeing a lot of calls, not just in China, but also in a lot of other countries, about supply chain, about being self-reliant, including for things like essential medical supplies. And even on the individual level, now all the seeds are sold out. I'm talking about gardening here. All the seeds are sold out in stores because people are suddenly wanting to become self-reliant by planting herbs and vegetables. So that has filtered down through individual level. It seems that people are just doing everything to be more self-reliant, to be almost like into apocalyptic prepping mindset.
Another potential lesson, which may not be taken out of this, is the importance of what Caixin et al. Did in those few weeks where they had sort of freedom to operate and really dig for the truth of what was actually happening. What's your sense of the government's read on that episode in time? There's a way to look at what Caixin et al. In the first few weeks of the virus in Wuhan as this incredible public service of, getting information out of a system which has a really hard time sort of reporting information up and down. So I guess my question is, like, what do you think is the government's take on the role that media played in this, coronavirus situation, and how you think the domestic media environment will evolve moving forward?
So Caixin did an incredible job around January when, the outbreak was first publicly acknowledged. There was a lot of reports about the extent of the problem, and also focusing on the sufferings of the people, as opposed to state media, which was focused on about heroic efforts by the people, especially the doctors and the construction workers. In terms of how the media landscape in the future, I think we look at one is that the government really cracked down on independent media reporting at the end of January. So clearly it does not like the fact that it does not control all the narrative. What do you think, Adam?
I think Caixin did an incredible job at pursuing stories on COVID-19, and some of the stuff that came out was absolutely fantastic. Human stories, investigative reporting that really held the local government to account in piecing together what was said, what was done, official meetings, official documents. So they did a really, really good job in what media in a liberal democracy is meant to do, which is to hold government to account. and inform the public. And for a good 2 weeks, they did that. And I think they had the liberty to do that because China's propaganda system was in disarray. Rather, the censors and the propagandists were still at a time when they were still trying to work out the message, right? And in a way, that investigative reporting and more free reporting had much greater value to the central government at that time in in giving them access to information that they otherwise wouldn't have, or at least through the usual channels. But I think ultimately, the party is really going back to its basics, which is the suppression of independent voices, the control of the mediums of information, but as well as the producer of content, using a variety of hard and soft levers. So I think on the Xi, we're unlikely to see in the foreseeable future a loosening of media freedom. If anything, I think there's going to be a push to tighten media freedom in such a way that the state would be better to dictate its narrative. But of course, I think if I could just make one more
yeah.
point here, and that is, I think it's very difficult for the party state to consistently, successfully manage the narrative because of unforeseen events, because of its old concepts of propaganda. It's increasingly getting better, but but given the size of China, the diversity of opinion, and the creativity of the people to get around the senses, it's very hard to control a narrative. It takes massive amount of effort.
It's also worthwhile to remember that one of the citizen journalists in Wuhan, Chen Qiushi, I think he is still missing or under detention. So clearly the pressure on media has not really eased at all. I think another worthwhile thing to remember with Chinese media is there's also almost a central local tension in media as reflected in political system. So, for example, local media may have to report to local government. So on local issues, they may not as free to report as some other media. So then we have independent media from elsewhere who probably has more degree of freedom to maneuver in a city that it's not based in. So those are some kind of details and tensions that's interesting to see from this COVID-19 episode as well.
Let's take a hard left turn and focus a bit on China-Australia relations. So why don't you guys tell me where to start? What are the key dynamics that all the ignorant American listeners should know about what exactly are the salient dynamics between the two countries?
Okay, well, China is Australia's biggest trading partner. And what people are concerned about, or news about China until recently has almost all about China's economy and our trade with it. Australia sees China's role mostly as a buyer of our exports, and that's mostly in minerals, mining sector. Now also in, for example, education, tourism, and agriculture producers. So from Australia's perspective, it usually almost exclusively see China as a source of revenue. And it is actually the reason why Australia, unlike many other countries in the West, we have not had a recession in 2008. So we had a continuous economic growth for a very long time, more than 20 years. But now, more recently, there has been increased concerns, especially among national security community, about China's role. And as it's becoming more powerful, we're seeing more concerns about its exercise of power inside Australia, especially its influence and interference activities. That has been on the news almost every day. Australia is very anxious about China's military power in the region as well. And this anxiety is linked to our military alliance with the United States, which has very long-standing. And we know that the United States has designated China as a strategic competitor. So there is a lot of debate in Australia about what does that mean for Australia. Another angle is that China is also a very large source of migrants for Australia, and Adam and I are both migrants to Australia from China. 5.6% of people in Australia describe their ancestry as Chinese in the last census, which is the highest non-British, non-Australian ancestry. But it's important to actually remember that Australia had a white Australia policy right from the Federation, from when Australia started in 1901 to as recently as 70s. So this racial tension we're now seeing a flaring up of that recently because of COVID as well.
What does that mean? What is a white Australian policy?
It's a series of legislations and policies and attitude essentially blocking off Asians from migrating to Australia and favouring white European migrants.
Yep, so it's mostly immigration policy.
Sure. So one of the dynamics with such a large population that has a connection to the mainland are these fears of interference and spies and influence on WeChat and social media. You guys recently wrote a report about these issues. I'm curious, first off, maybe starting with, what do you think the CCP's goals are when it comes to influencing Australian opinion, and how good are they at it?
The goal of all foreign influence activities is to make foreign governments' policies more favorable to China or to any other country. That's the goal of all influence activities. And that includes legitimate activities such as diplomacy, public communication, and to illegitimate activities, including bribery, coercion, intimidation. But they all share the same goal, which is to make the foreign government enact policies more favorable.
What are the key hot points that the Chinese government is trying to influence opinion on?
So there is another one target for the Chinese government in particular when it comes to in Australian diaspora, is that they also target at the Chinese diaspora to keep the diaspora loyal to China while minimizing criticism from the diaspora community. Because the diaspora community has actually historically been a source of agitation for change and reform inside China. So the Chinese government does not necessarily trust the diaspora community very much. So what it does want is to, the public communication to keep it loyal, and also use intimidation tactics, including pressuring their families inside China to keep them more compliant to Chinese government's interests.
I suppose on a quite general level, China's influence and interference activities are aimed at paving a way for policies and choices that are more conducive to Chinese interests, whether that be in the security realm or in the economic realm or in terms of public opinion. We recently wrote a submission to the Australian Senate on China's interference activities through social media. So, in our submission, we talked about how China is not a big actor in manipulating social media that are in English, but increasingly it is becoming more active, and we think that in the foreseeable future it would be the source of the biggest threat. We saw that in terms of COVID. We saw that in terms of Hong Kong, the protests in Hong Kong and the US-China trade war. So increasingly we're seeing examples of the Chinese party state being more active on English language social media in trying to influence and manipulate these platforms.
One thing we need to really be clear about in this foreign influence interference debate, and I want to emphasize that because this debate has become quite almost emotional in Australia, so that there is a difference between foreign influence and interference. Interference is seen as illegitimate activities. It's a subset of influence activity. So while we're trying to combat interference activities in Australia, we should not necessarily want to stop legitimate influence such as, diplomacy I think that's quite proper to have legitimate influence. Every government does it. And another thing we really need to remember when it comes to this debate is that often the Chinese diaspora communities are victims of interference activities, and we should really see them as, well, we should see them as part of the solution, part of the Australian society, part of the solution in when we're combating interference, and not see them as, a vector of interference.
I think it's certainly taken a toll on the Chinese diaspora community in Australia, and it's leading to increased racialized narrative, and we see this most recently in terms of COVID, about Chinese people buying up medical supplies, for example, or at least that's and sending it to China. At least that's the narrative that's been put out by a few media. So I definitely think in any kind of discussions we need to be conscious of the facts and the evidence, as well as just to ensure that we're not harming the Chinese diaspora community.
And I see there's a recent op-ed by Andrew Young in the United States about Asian Americans, and I think the points are quite relevant here in Australia as well, because there is also a call for Chinese Australians in Australia to demonstrate their loyalty to Australia, as if without demonstration, some kind of loyalty, we're not full Australians. So that debate is also happening in Australia as well, just like in the United States. Chinese Australians should be seen as Australians. They don't need to do anything over the top to demonstrate their loyalty. They are entitled to opinions just like all other Australians.
I think our China debate needs to move beyond the kind of narratives that focus on pro-China or anti-China, but to recognize the existence of the People's Republic and how much it influences Australian interests and well-being, and to really grapple with I guess the most important foreign policy question today in Australia, which is how do we navigate the treacherous strait in a fast changing world between the United States and China, and in the context of strategic flux.
Let's close on the process of doing research about the Chinese government. So you two guys recently republished Holly Snape's Researching Party Documents Guide, which I encourage everyone out there to check out on the Neican newsletter. But I guess I'm curious, aside from the specifics that goes into, with where to search for certain things, what sort of broader advice do you have about the mindset that people should take when trying to understand Chinese government policy?
Yeah, I think the biggest point from me is that you need to go and read these documents in Chinese. So it's interesting that I think the CCP is actually fairly honest in the sense that it's very meticulous about documentation, about writing out what it thinks and it wants to achieve. So a lot of the stuff is actually just out there for people to read. So I would just simply say go and read these documents in their original Chinese.
I agree with that, totally agree with that. I think if you want to understand Chinese policy, read what the Chinese government or the CCP say about itself, really understand how institutions work, but also you need to really think about the incentives at play for individuals within the system, for people at local level, for people at central level, for people at provincial level, and how those incentives can be tempered by culture and institutions. But really just to, it's not a Chinese people or the Chinese system, it's not an alien system. It's out there. You can understand it. Just have to put in the effort.
Any particular topics you think need more people from outside China digging deep on?
So my day job is on the POA, so I do research on China's military, but where in my spare time I look at party historiography, so how the party thinks about history.
You just stole my answer. I was going to say history as well. How history
There
is
you
written,
go.